We will record this broadcast for BCTV and radio WVEW. It will be about a week to 10 days before each of them get this recording and shape it up for their own presentation. But at that point, you can go to BCTV and type in Tim Kipp, or just type in the date, and the presentation will appear on your screen. As soon as BCTV puts it onto their web network, it also goes to YouTube, so that you can also go to YouTube, click BCTV, and then through that, click Tim Kipp, Is There Democracy in America?, which is the title of his presentation for this evening. Tim is well known to everybody here on the screen, teacher for nearly 4 decades at Brattleboro High School and another high school, and a intellectual, public activist, and public intellectual all the way through. Since you all know him, I don't need to elaborate more. What I'll do is just turn it over to you, Tim.
The last time I spoke about the same topic, but now elaborating on it, and the topic is there democracy in America? And I have more time tonight to talk about it, and that's what I intend to do. And I would argue right off the bat that the United States was not founded on democratic principles, or if we, you may want to look at it as, you've heard a lot about critical race theory. Well, this is critical political theory, just to piss off the right wing a little bit. You look at Jamestown, you look at Plymouth. They were founded on religious intolerance, on imperialism, on genocide, and systemic racism. So how could it be that we were a democracy and we were founded on an idea we were told over and over again in the grand mythology of US history that we were founded on the ideas of democracy? How could we have been and sustained that when we either drove people from the land, slaughtered them, or enslaved them as animals? Native populations in North America went from 10 to 20 million, and now more scholarship is saying it's higher than that in 1500 to 250,000 in 1900. Africans were captured and made slaves for nearly 250 years, reaching a peak of 4 million in bondage by the time of the Civil War. This country still confronts the consequences of this legacy of oppression. During the horrendous regime of Trump, political analysts, mainstream media, conventional historians conjured the decline of, the erosion of, the assault on, the undermining of, the twilight of, or the pending end days of democracy. Well, I would like to posit something different, that we are not, in fact, a democracy. While there have been significant and magnificent episodes of true struggles for and expressions of democracy, they have only come as a reaction to the lack of democracy in our history. It is the victims of this political and economic system who have led the struggle for real democracy. Real democracy in the United States is found in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, the labor movement, the gender rights movement, environmental movement, etc. And at the same time, all advances that have been made from the days of the revolution on have been countered by a revanchist movement of corporate backlash. So for every time there's a progressive movement, there's always going to be, there always has been a backlash to rectify, to redeem, like they did after the Civil War when the conservatives redeemed the South by giving back whites their power. About the only time that we've had any sustained kind of progressivism was during the emergence of the New Deal during the Depression, and then for a few decades after that, up into the 60s. But in that time, they were also abetted, they fortunately were abetted by the most progressive era of the Supreme Court, with the Warren Court starting in 1954. The founders of our country created a rhetorical and historical trap for themselves and indeed for us. We are a nation founded on the ideal of democracy and the idea of democracy. And when at those times when people try to cash in that promise or that promissory note, demanding the country live up to its articulated ideals, the people are met with government intransigence, opposition, and or class and or white backlash. I maintain that the Trump administration is not in any way an aberration. It is a logical consequence of a long-term undemocratic system. What I want to do tonight is explore the undemocratic nature of our system from a structural and historical point of view by examining key aspects of the Constitution, the party system, and the Supreme Court. Let me hasten to add that there are in our society strong examples of democracy. And if I look at Vermont, the state government in Vermont, local government in Vermont, and that you can find that across the country, there are fine examples of democracy in action. Most of what I'm talking about now is about the federal action and the connection between corporations and the political system. And there's where you find the lack of democracy. So what my analysis says, suggests is that it's not a question of a failure of leadership. Rather, it's a question of failure of the structure of the system itself. So the more, if we have malevolent and incompetent leaders, that's one thing. And we certainly have had those and still have those, but there's a larger context, and that's the structure of our system, the very nature of our system. So let's start with the Constitution. It was from the beginning a corporatist constitution. It was written by the few for the benefit of the few. 55 delegates of the colonial elite meet in 1787 and revise the Articles of Confederation. Well, what's interesting about that whole process is that who was not invited, who was not at the table at that time with those 55 delegates from the colonial elite? And we know it very well. Native Americans, women, obviously slaves, other people of color, and anybody of the lower classes were not at the table when they were thrashing out what a new government should look like. The people were excluded from making the Constitution, and they were excluded from ratifying the Constitution when the document had to go before the state, the then created states, for ratification. The same echelon, the same class stratification was evident at the ratification in the states as there were at the founding convention. Interesting, at a very mainstream, well-respected conventional historian, Edwin Morgan, in his book, American Slavery and American Freedom, said that the grand irony of the nation was that a nation born in slavery, the idea of freedom, the rhetorical basis of our founding, was reliant upon the establishment and the perpetuation of slavery. So the people were excluded from writing the Constitution and, in fact, ratifying it. But should this really come as a surprise? If we look just behind the scenes a little bit and look into the minds, if you will, of the founding fathers, and they were fathers, listen to the ideas of these influential people. As to the need for a constitution, Madison, the father of the Constitution, and I'll refer to him throughout this, Madison says, to secure the public good and private rights against the dangers of such factions, i.e. class, and at the same time, preserve the spirit and the form of popular government. That's what we need a constitution for. He says, the most Common and durable sources of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property, i.e. wealth. And that we need a constitution that checks the leveling impulses. That was a popular term at the time, the levelers. You were a leveler, meaning you were actually a small d Democrat wanting to have equality, heaven forbid. So the checking the leveling impulses of property, the property-less multitude who comprise the majority faction. And I find that very interesting because what we need to identify all the time today is that the majority of the people are not being served in this putative democracy. Listen to George Washington. A new constitution was needed to, quote, contain the threat of the people rather than to embrace their participation. There are combustibles in each state to which a spark may set fire. Edmund Randolph of Virginia. We need a constitution to quell the turbulence and the follies of democracy. It's seldom that you hear this kind of frank exposure of reality. Roger Sherman from Connecticut said, the people should have as little to do as may be about government, unquote. And one of my favorites, one of the most transparent of all, is John Jay from New York. He said, the people who own the country ought to run it. The people that own the country ought to run it. Years later, President John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, said that the effect of the Constitution was to, quote, increase the influence, power, and wealth of those who already have it. Now, I'm giving you quotes from people who are not radicals by any means, but they are realists and seeing how the power is configured and distributed. The great historian Charles Beard, in his economic interpretation of the Constitution, still a classic and still well regarded, he wrote this interpretation of the Constitution in 1913. He says said that the elites were confident in their belief that what was good for them would be good for the country. Michael Parenti, the radical political scientist in more contemporary times, says the Constitution was designed to win popular support, but it would not temper the existing class structure. It would create a government strong enough to service the growing needs of the entrepreneurial and landed classes while withstanding the egalitarian demands of the ordinary populace. So we have then we have the appearance of democracy, and certainly Madison was so excited about and so driven by making sure that this Constitution was ratified that he was willing to compromise in key areas, and I'll make reference to this in the future here. Key areas that would preserve slave power, slave ownership, and preserve the rights of property. So if you look at the Constitution itself, the very nature of it, its structure, its nature, its function, is undemocratic. Now, this is a not widely accepted view. If we compare this, and this is what happens with historians have historically done, and that is they've compared what the United States was creating in the 1700s with what was happening around the world. And if you do that, yes, there's no question that there were advancements. The idea of some kind of mechanism whereby the people had some say in what they are, in what who was governing them. No question about it. There was a serious development here. The question now is, how far did that democracy go, and how much was it ever sustained? So the Constitution, in and of itself, immediately protects property rights over human rights. It centralizes and consolidates power, and it gives power to the financial elites, and it limits the franchise, and this is well known, to white male property holders. In addition, the Constitution protects commerce first. in the debates, and if you read the debates of based on the notes that James Madison wrote during the Constitution, the convention, as you may know, it was they were closed meetings. Even the windows were closed and shades drawn, so no one outside could just hear or discover what was actually being talked about. So we really were getting this mainly through the ideas and the notes of James Madison. The Commerce Clause, which is Article 1, Section 8, was one of the least debated issues in the Constitutional Convention of 3.5 months. Regulation of commerce, taxation, tariffs, etc., all measures of concern to investors and creditors. There was a near universal consensus of the Constitution, and all of this passed with very little debate. There was an immediate consensus. This was also true in other aspects of the Constitution, Article 3 and Article 4, which also address the issues of commerce and the issues of private property. It's interesting to look at the Bill of Rights, which was attached in 1791, that over half the articles of the Bill of Rights that were supposed to be for what about the people, in order to include getting support and broadening the support for the Constitution, Madison and company had to include a Bill of Rights in order to say, well, what are the rights of the people? Well, it's interesting, if you look at those first 10 amendments, over half of them are explicitly property rights issues. You look at the second, the third, fourth, fifth, seventh, and eighth, of which I'm not going to go through, but they all fundamentally talk about protecting property. Let's take the lens farther up in our history. In 1888, the president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, opined about the nature and impact of the Constitution. Again, Grover Cleveland, no radical. Quote, classes are rapidly forming. I think it was a little late on that notion, but classes are rapidly forming, one comprising the very rich and powerful, while in another are found the toiling poor, unquote. And they said, corporations are fast becoming the people's masters. That's Grover Cleveland. Again, the unconstitutional nature of the Constitution is seen in how it creates, to extent creates, but certainly perpetuates a stratified class structure. And the most obvious way is the exploitation of slaves, women, natives, the working class, and poor. You don't find a lot of protection in the Constitution, virtually nothing in the Constitution when it comes to these groups of people, which were the vast majority of the people. The most classic example is the 3/5 compromise that perpetuates slavery and gives slave states more representation in Congress. There was the ban. Yes, we banned slavery according to the Constitution 1807, but in fact, that was piffle. It was ignored, it was circumvented, and it was not in any way held to account. Another key aspect of the Constitution, as I see it, was that it establishes a long-term socialization of inferiority. The socialization of inferiority, to wit, we had 246 years of legal or de jure slavery, which amounted to 12 generations of human beings in this country being held as animals. And then, of course, replacing that during the time of when Reconstruction ends after the Civil War, you have then a period of neo-slavery that in many ways, I would argue that we have it till up to this day, a neo-slavery of Jim Crow system that's still in existence. An interesting, I read a book by Carol Anderson called The Second, a fascinating book about the Second Amendment. And she argues that the Second Amendment had nothing to do with gun ownership rights, but what it had to do was empowering vigilantes to protect slave property. and armed whites could then go after property, and they could be the vigilantes, not unlike what we may see in Texas with this abortion fiasco. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then also the subsequent one of 1850, you have the rights of whites to carry guns. African Americans could not carry guns. Native Americans, if they could get them, were not allowed to carry guns, but whites could carry guns and could be used in order to challenge the notion of slavery and to protect it. And lastly, the Constitution of the United States, and this to me is the most extraordinary omission, says nothing about human rights, not even in the Bill of Rights. So where is it in the Constitution it talks about healthcare as a right, shelter, homes as a right, food as a right, employment as a right, education as a right, or retirement as a right? Nowhere in this Constitution can you find that. Interestingly enough, in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt, in his last State of the Union address, said that we need an economic Bill of Rights. And he said we need employment with a livable wage. He used the term livable wage. We need housing. We'll need medical care. We need Social Security. We need education. Needless to say, his request went nowhere in Congress. Neither Democrats or Republicans were interested in dealing with such structural changes that may have an incredible impact on the lives of Americans. It's interesting today, the closest we're coming to that today would be what's happening in Congress now with the infrastructure bill and trying to expand that for daycare, for education rights, for welfare, if you will, subsidies and so forth. And Bernie wanted 6 trillion. Right now, the bill is down to 3.5 trillion, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. So we're still struggling with a constitution that hasn't guaranteed people their basic human rights. Thus, what you have then is a prevailing doctrinal system that prevents the consideration of viable alternative systems, such as a democratic socialist system. So how is all of this really the foundation for democracy? I would argue that it's not. It is not. One of the key aspects of the Constitution that I think also has lent itself to structural undemocratic policies is federalism. Federalism, as you may remember from your high school political science class, is shared power between the states and the federal government. It very much sounded very democratic. So we're not going to have an overweening centralized power. We're going to have states share that power. And that's it. And I think when it started, that was a great idea. As it quickly evolved, however, and if you look at particularly Article 10 of the Bill of Rights, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, should be reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It sounds great, but in practice, what has happened really from the get-go is an undemocratic outcomes. In fact, federalism, that concept, has created some of the most viciously contested constitutional terrain in our history. And we see it mainly in what you remember this, maybe first heard about it in the 60s or the 50s and 60s, the concept of states' rights. The federal government is trying to overtake the rights of us in the states in our right to control our need and our affairs. And Congress, abetted by a historically conservative Supreme Court, has used states' rights. The states, as well as Congress, as the states, as well as Congress, have used the rallying cry of states' rights for reactionary purposes, for reactionary forces. It was states' rights that was in defense of slavery. It was states' rights in defense of denying civil rights. the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, the civil rights amendments that came out of the Civil War, were quickly undermined by the Supreme Court and by the states. And the era of Reconstruction from 1860s, late 60s to 1875 and 76 would quickly destroy the rights of the brief rights that Blacks gained in education and in political representation. And so then you would have the institution of Jim Crow by the 1880s, and then reinforced by Supreme Court decisions, and the most monumental of which was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which it codified segregation as a reality of that would define our country till 1956. The federalism and states' rights were used to defend laissez-faire, to oppose government regulation. It was states' rights that would have to prevail. And then it became corporate rights. And a classic example of that is in 1886, the Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which basically established in an indirect way the idea that corporations have the rights of people and therefore have the rights and protections accorded to people. The federalism was used to destroy unions. Federalism, and I'm not going to go into that in detail, but it was the unions are at the weakest point they've been in our history since the 1950s right now, with about 6% of the labor force being organized. Federalism facilitated, did and is to this very day facilitating voter suppression and gerrymandering. The Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013 is an example. I'll be talking a little bit more about those specifics as we move along. Also, federalism defines the very nature of how we elect people to office. States control the election process, not the federal government. Partisan manipulation of elections, biased secretaries of state. Yes, it's very interesting that an elected secretary of state being very partisan will control the election process, and we expect them to be neutral. They establish the qualifications for voting, procedures, and the like. A new wave of partisan control over legislature to overturn the elections has been in existence now, certainly since the beginnings of the Trump administration, and arguably well before that. Just in 2021, 400 bills are now in 41 states are designed right now, or pending in one form or another to undermine democratic elections. Now I want to talk about the undemocratic nature of our political representation system. I would argue that our system does not adequately, fairly reflect who the voters are, who the people are, in any way, shape, or form. Our federal system does not represent the people in class, color, or any other form. The majority interests are, as a matter of fact, the majority interests in our representative system are ignored. Polling after polling will indicate where people want more money for education, they want more money for environmental protection, they want to spend less for military and so forth. Well, how often does that come up? Or how often does it become viable? How often do housing, unemployment, education, healthcare, rates of poverty, childhood poverty, violence, income, wealth inequality, how often do these things get debated in Congress? And if it wasn't for people like Sanders and the progressive women that have come after him, we wouldn't be talking about this at all on the federal level. And even though it It is a tough road to hoe. It is a tough mountain to climb. It is exciting, very exciting to have people actually talking about these things and confronting these old white men with these issues. Madison himself designed the Senate to be apart from the people. It wasn't until 1913 that the direct election of the Senate was built into the Constitution with the 17th Amendment. The Senate remains an upper class club. 66% are millionaires or billionaires, and only 9% of people are people of color in the Senate. 41% of the House are millionaires or billionaires, with 22% people of color. That's the high water mark. Today, and if you look at the Senate representation, well, based upon the Connecticut Compromise that you may recall, was 2 senators for every state, which is a gross violation of the rights of the larger states. So my state of Vermont, with 630,000 people, has 2 senators. California has, with 40 million people, has 2 senators, and the likes. Today in the Senate, the makeup of the Senate in 2021, Senate Democrats represent 40 million more voters than Senate Republicans, based upon those demographics, large state versus small state. 40 million more. Is that democratic? Is the Senate democratic when it's that kind of representation? How could that be democratic? So when we have a structure like this that doesn't represent the people, whose interests are going to be served? Who will speak the loudest? Who will get heard the most? The interests of those with privilege, white privilege, caste, class, and corporate privilege will be heard the most. In recent decades, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, with the exceptions that I've already made having to do with recent legislation and efforts by progressives, neither Democrats nor Republicans have enacted policies that address the true material interests of the majority of people today. They make what the New Deal was in that brief period in our history look like some radical idea coming from Karl Marx. According to a well-regarded 2017 study by 2 mainstream political scientists, Gillens and Page, they say that the representation system has broken down. It does not work. According to them, according to their book, the majority of American public actually have little influence over policy. Policy making is dominated. This is Gillens and Page talking. Policy making is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent individuals. And this is a longitudinal study that is still regarded now in political science circles as being a well done, well accepted thesis. There is little mention, according to Gillens and Page, you find little mention of fair tax policies or how broaden access to education or healthcare or strengthening collective bargaining for unions or redistribution of the wealth. As an example of this, I used to give my students in class a thought experiment. I said, what if tomorrow every member of Congress were now coming from the working class and the poor, or some from the homeless? If they were all they came from that class, what would legislation look like? What would Congress, what would policy look like? Imagine how the laws of our system and government would change. Now I'd like to talk about the not so grand alliance of corporations and politicians. Again, this is keeping Gillens and Page in mind in terms of their findings. We see corporate influence from day one. U.S. corporate sector dominates the government process, whereby the Congress actually does the bidding of corporations. Corporate interests in alliance with Congress construct a world built on assumptions of unexamined, privileged, white, class, and corporate. So what's the significance of this? Why should we be concerned about this undemocratic alliance between corporations and politicians? First of all, that alliance defines how government operates. The rules of legislation, the oversight, the investigation, all have corporate influences as to outcomes and futures. This alliance creates or defines who gets to play in this system, who gets to run for office, what kind of money is used, who can actually raise money to do this, how can you raise the money, how power is constructed, and how nominees, both judicial and cabinet nominees, are brought forward. What laws are made also, it defines what laws are made and who benefits. When the wealthy write the rules, their interests will be served first and foremost. If I may step back a few years to 1776 and Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote, even though he's no radical by any means, but he wrote about the vile maxim, V-I-L-E, the vile maxim. And this is what his vile maxim was. And he warned of this. He talked about the masters of the universe. Well, the masters of the universe, and that's his term, were in fact the corporate owners. Quote, the merchants and manufacturers make certain that their own interest, in Smith's words, are most particularly attended to, unquote. So in other words, the rich will in fact serve their own interests first and foremost, and then maybe later on down the road, if there's enough public pressure from the people to change that or to alter that or to refine it to a certain extent. 100 years later, after Adam Smith, Marx would call this a class analysis. So I think it's fair to say that economic power equals political power and vice versa. If you look at the wealthy who write the rules and their interests will be served first and foremost. All you have to do is look at the American Legislative Exchange Council, which was, amongst others, a Koch brothers funded agency that's been around for many years, 20 years at least, and they have been active mainly on the state level and defining and writing legislation, but also on the federal level, literally writing the legislation and then offering it to and giving it to legislators to adopt as their own. So continuing along these lines, corporate dark money influence. This has been talked about quite a bit, and I would commend a number of books on this about how unacceptable this corporate influence is in Congress and the judiciary. From 2000 and 2020, to give you an example of this, mainly during the Roberts Court, he comes on in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of corporate interest 80 times to 0. 80 times to 0. So what does this alliance, this connection between corporations and politicians really mean? How does it play out? First of all, it weakened or destroyed the civil court's ability to have citizens and juries get involved under the 7th Amendment. It protects dark money in politics, and I think you probably know that term, dark money, meaning that we don't know where the money is coming from because Congress has passed laws and regulations that will allow these people to hide where they're throwing their money. It has this alliance has destroyed any modicum, any suggestion of a federal regulatory system, a system that is fundamentally non-existent in terms of real oversight and real meaning to protect the American people. This system, as is probably the most well-known in this analysis, fosters the suppression of the vote. The Koch machine, as I call it, since 2004, the Koch brothers ran the largest dark money network. 17 allied groups funded legislation to candidates and court nominees, the Heritage Foundation, Alex, and so forth. In 2020, 9 of the 10 largest dark money spenders were conservative candidates. And I'd really commend Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's work. I would say he's doing some of the most serious work in analyzing dark money in our system, both in the judicial system and the legislative system in general. His work on Amy Conant Barrett and her hearings, I think was very pertinent and exquisite work. So think about that vile maxim again. So how is all of this democratic? In what ways is what we're talking about, what I'm talking about here, in any way democratic? I would argue it's not democratic. That occasionally we have democracy in little spurts and spasms, but it doesn't coalesce into a whole system. It's not a structural democracy. Our two-party system is a monopoly, for instance. What is a two-party system of Democrats and Republicans? It crowds out alternatives. Viable alternatives disappear. How often do they really get any kind of currency in our history? What this two-party monopoly does is it creates a Republican Democratic consensus on the virtues of our economic system of capitalism. This, no matter who they are, from Bernie Sanders, well, maybe not Bernie Sanders, but certainly Warren, Elizabeth Warren, all the way down and then all the way across the spectrum to the far right, will say that capitalism is the only game in town and the one game, the only system that really works. This two-party system, monopoly, embodies corporate privilege. It serves the interests of the wealth first and foremost. How often, other than times like the New Deal and the Great Society in the 1960s, has a government really comprehensively attempted to address the needs of the poor? What's interesting too is that if you look at what's going on today with the $3.5 trillion budget bill in terms of infrastructure, this still doesn't come close to what Franklin Roosevelt did in the New Deal. A two-party monopoly defines what is acceptable politically. It excludes alternatives, the ideas and the parties. And as exciting as Bernie Sanders has been, and energizing and positive and struggling for real democracy, Bernie, I believe, is only going to end up as a footnote, a significant footnote in our history, but a footnote nonetheless. Party monopolies really forces a Hobson choice, lesser of two evils dilemma. It makes the people who want to vote for their conscience and for their self-interest, it makes them actually makes them antagonistic to alternative parties. And they are afraid of the spoiler effect. Oh, if I support him, we'll definitely get the other candidate, at least liked candidate, to win. This two-party monopoly promotes personality over party, and party platforms are utterly meaningless. And as far as I'm concerned, they have never had any significance. When's the last time people called the party into question for not following the party platform at the convention? If you compare this to European parliamentary systems, their parties stand for definable positions. People vote for the party which it stands for. Now, I know this is breaking down. I know that system is is no longer as viable as it used to be, but they still have a multi-party system, a viable one that may have 3 or 4 parties or more. And those parties by design are supposed to stand for something. And technically you vote for the party and not the person. And so you know who you're voting for, you know what you're getting when you vote for the Labor Party or the Socialist Party or the Christian Right Party or whatever it may be. Last effect, I think, and one of the most significant effect of this monopoly of 2 parties is that it causes voter alienation. Historically, classically, when people don't vote, as we all well know, the United States has the lowest voter turnout rate of any industrialized society. And usually the blame is on the people. Oh, the people are lazy, they don't care. They get off their asses, we could get something done. I totally think that's heading in the wrong direction. It's alienation. And what is it about? Why are they alienated? Because the system isn't working for them. How many times have we heard a Republican or Democratic candidate really talk about the interest of low-income people, of working class, so forth, or promote unions, with the exception, again, of people like Bernie, all right? So what we have is an alienated population that sees no reason to be voting. There's no utility to it. And so until a more multi-party system is created, a more democratic, broadly representative system is created, people are not going to vote, in my view. The Harris poll has done, and I'm not going to go into the details, in 1966, and has done it just about every year since, has done an alienation, they call it the Alienation Index, a measure of how Americans feel about whether their concerns are being heard or addressed by those people in power. And you can predict on the alienation scale of how bad the United States comes out. Compared to our system, European democratic systems, viable multi-party systems, broader spectrum of people's interests are being included, the poor and the working class. And what's the result of that compared to the United States? Higher voter turnout. More and stronger social systems, a social structure that provides for from people in housing, healthcare, education, employment, and not last but not least, it creates a higher standard of living. The United States, as you know, has one of the lower standards of living these days, and for the richest country in the world. Now that. When you compare the United States to European democracies, we pale in existence. Okay, the last topic I want to talk about now is the Supreme Court. And let me see what kind of time I have. Okay, I think I've got enough time here. The Supreme Court is the most undemocratic, most privileged sector of our government. They serve for life terms, highly politicized nomination process, and they are imbued with an excessive amount of power. Jefferson called it the most Jefferson of all people called it the most aristocratic of branches of government. White male branch of government. Of the 113 justices, 106 have been white guys, 2 blacks, and 5 women, and including our latest one. According to Russell Galloway in his study of the Supreme Court, said the quote, the court's personnel were recruited mainly from the class of corporate lawyers, so there was no shortage of empathy with the desires of expanding capitalism. Now, he was talking about the early Supreme Court in the early 1800s. This quote absolutely applies to today. The founders were conflicted about the proper role and the power of the Supreme Court. Jefferson feared that it would be despotic and that there would be no recourse. The anti-federalist founders felt the unelected Supreme Court should not have the power to nullify an act of Congress. If a law is unconstitutional, Congress, who represents the people, should change the law. And so in his conventional historical terms, the 1803 Marbury versus Madison decision by John Marshall was not considered controversial at all. It was considered strong legislative and judicial or a strong judicial policy. And that was the idea that Congress had the courts had the ability to nullify an act of Congress, and that they had the last word. So this idea of judicial review was never put in. There's nothing, if you look at the Constitution, you read it, there's nothing in the Constitution about judicial review. So Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall makes it up. He puts it in himself. And as such, it became the law of the land to this day, or a practice of the Supreme Court. Jefferson, to his credit, was not happy with this. He said it amounted to judicial usurpation and a violation of the separation of powers and checks and balances. This would give the Supreme Court too much power. In a letter to Abigail Adams, Jefferson wrote, "If the Marbury versus Madison judicial review decision is sound, then indeed is our Constitution a complex fellow de se, a suicide pact, and, quote, a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary." That's a pretty powerful statement about one of the most important aspects of our government. So what was Jefferson's answer to that? He said, if a constitutional question does arise, the people's representative in Congress should decide. The people's representative, those who are elected to office, should decide, not somebody appointed, not some class stratified elitist from the Supreme Court should they decide, but rather a committee are designated by Congress. In 2015, Jimmy Carter, again, no radical.
Recordings.
Because what Jimmy Carter said was that because of misuse of judicial review, we are an oligarchy. Can't get it more direct than that. We are an oligarchy. And I'm not going to go into who gets on the Supreme Court. As we've seen recently, being explored quite well. So what we have then is a Supreme Court that puts corporate rights over human rights. And I'll outline some of the reasons or some of the ways that it does that. First of all, it upholds the Commerce Clause at every chance it can get. It makes corporations a person, corporate personhood, as I mentioned, the Santa Clara decision. In the Lochner era of 1890 to 1937, the courts struck down every economic regulation on wages and hours and working conditions and child labor. So any protection that the court could have offered people, working people, was destroyed. The same is true of labor unions in general. If you look at the Antitrust Act of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Supreme Court interpreted not as breaking up corporations and large corporations, but it was used to attack unions. So unions were restraints of trade and not the corporations. And as a result of this, and if you look at Taft-Hartley in 1947, the anti-union making the right to work and make it much more difficult organized to form a union. The result of this has been we have the lowest union rate in the developed world, about 6%, as I've mentioned. The high was even a paltry 35%. And as a result of that, there's I believe, a direct correlation between the strength and the health of a middle class and the strength and the health of a union movement. The Supreme Court, in addition, said that money is speech and has undermined the process of free elections with its horrendous decisions on campaign finance. The Buckley decision, the Citizens United decision, the McCutcheon decision are just some of the ways that the Supreme Court has protected corporate speech and unlimited amounts of money going into campaigns. Well known, with one notable exception, a few notable exceptions, we know that the Supreme Court has undermined this the history of Blacks and the status of Blacks throughout our history. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were overturned, nullified in effect by Supreme Court decisions subsequent to that. Dred Scott decision of 1857, which laid the foundation in many ways. Well, there are many foundations, but laid the foundations for the Civil War. The Roberts Court has been the most pro-corporate, pro-deregulation, anti-voting court in the history of the United States. Hell, made Robert B. Taney look like a civil libertarian. Robert B. Taney is the one who decided in the majority opinion in the Dred Scott decision. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now. There's more I could say about the Supreme Court, but I think in the interest of time and so forth, let me just say this. The United States, I believe, is a plutocracy. Where there is plutocracy, there is no democracy. Which Che Guevara said, where there's hunger, there is no democracy. The structural and historical aspects of our political economy constitute an undemocratic system. And I think we need to end our delusional notion that we are democracy. What we are basing this on is historic myth, and that myth serves the interest of those in power. It serves those who want to retain power. And until we break that myth, I don't think we have a chance of moving forward. It's not to say this is not doom and gloom. Everything I've said does not preclude the possibility of change. All I'm doing is saying what I believe to be a reality that's very seldom talked about. We can make changes, we can make a difference, but we have to first recognize what our history is and what our reality is today, that we are not a democracy. And if we keep referring to it as a democracy, then I don't think we will engender the kind of support we're going to need to have wholesale structural changes in this economy and in this political system in order to really realize what I believe to be the true nature of what government's about, and that's serving the people. That's all the people, not just the wealthy. Plutocracies and oligarchies can be transformed, but we can't use the same disease system to change the system. Real democracy is a process that requires perpetual maintenance. The goal should be a democratic, socialist, or some form of political economy that meets the needs of the majority of the people. And it's very simple to say, and I know it's a challenge for all of us to do that, but it is a goal that is worthy of attempting. Thank you. You know, when I was doing this, when I was putting this together a while ago, I listed off the top of my head about 20 different topics that I could have talked about. So I narrowed it down to what I did. But, you know, it's just, to me, that's indicative of the deficits, the weakness of the structure of our system.
Indeed, indeed. And you know, but you ended with you know, quite strong and you said, without elaborating, and I wonder if you could elaborate just a little bit about, we have moments of democracy that we can point to, and we have opportunities for democracy that we can look at. Would you name one opportunity for democracy?
Sure. Campaign finance reform. If we could get an honest campaign finance system together, we could then start looking at getting more representative people who represent what America is about. So you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be white, you don't have to be male by and large, but rather if we can spread out that representation system, then the interests of the people who are joined the Congress will be more reflective of what the interest of the country is. So that would, if I had to just pick one, that would be one. But if you could pick any number of issues, and the reality is that all the issues that we could identify all have to be in concert. They all have to be choreographed and fought for in equal vigor. So I wouldn't want to boil it down to one, or even though I just did, if I was forced to. So that would be one. I can talk about other things as well, or other people can talk about other things. So those are avenues for that.
Yeah.
And I know that it's reformist. I know it is incremental, but it also, you know, what I will do that in place of nothing. We have a political system with very limited choice, and so the fact that we have to rely on sometimes liberal approaches, reformist approaches, step-by-step approaches, is what we're left with. And I'm not prepared to start building bombs. It's not going to work for me. I'd blow myself up. I've never felt that was a viable alternative, and I think history has proven it to be so, at least in this country. I don't know about Cuba. I mean, Cuba is an interesting model for sure, but yeah.
The overlap of the absence of democracy and the absence of action on climate change opens the gates basically for this whole generation. Anybody who's under 35 or under 40 at this point almost is completely clear that there is very little democracy, there's very little representation. Exactly the points you make, that the majority of humans are not represented by the system to which we pay loyalty. And so what are we going to do? And so that, the sunshine movement, sunrise movement rather, and other similar organizations, Theta, Thunberg, and so forth. How do we get folks under 35 and folks over 60 to meet in the middle?
Mm-hmm. Anybody can do that.
Yeah. One thing I'm having some issues with myself is that I believe your premise to be essentially correct, Tim. And I will openly admit that I have lived most of my life under a myth. And as such, my question for myself is personal. You can't answer it. How to address this situation, because the groundwork is totally shifted with this view. Now, it doesn't mean that which you have fought for, that various democratic movements have fought for, are not viable, but they are fleeting. I feel as if I'm in the same situation in relation to right at this moment as I have been as a younger person to a religion that I was brought up with. I haven't found a congregation that I belong to again, in an understanding of what I personally can accomplish and do. This is really, I hate to use the word, but it's true. It's a shift of a analyzed paradigm by which we work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is a really complex answer to the individual. I think, of course, to speak of it amongst ourselves, grassroots, yes. But what does it mean in relation to what the individual can, in fact, do is what I need to find out for myself. If I find some answers, I'll let you know. And if you find some, I would like to know them as well.
And certainly, it seems to me that the compelling stability of this country, and even though I don't regard it as stable, the people in power pretty much still see it as stable because they're still in power, is that most of us, all of us, in many ways or another, really do feel disempowered in trying to come up with an answer. What's the answer to this? Which is all absolutely legitimate and should be on the table. But we thrash around for the edges, and we reform, and we shave here, and we paint here, and we polish here, and all at the edges, and don't really get to the root of it all. And that's certainly disempowering, as I started with. But it certainly is a form of stability for those in power. And so and if we do nothing, that it reinforces it even further. Yeah.
Well, your last point is specifically that if we do nothing, it just enforces it even further. But I'll talk to you more about it later. And I'd love to hear the next broadcast where there might be some people having direct responses to this one.
Yeah. Thanks, Leonard. It doesn't, there are not enough openings for helping bridge the gap between the representation deficit of the federal government to the people. That deficit, which is supposed to be technically ameliorated with the census and the decade and so forth, and Charles Koch understood how to manipulate that about 40 years ago. It stole America in 2010 with state legislative restructuring, gerrymandering, et cetera. And so the great divide of America has always been money versus not money. And as Tim eloquently presented, the purpose was always to keep the majority away. The purpose of America has always been to keep the majority at bay. And and the groovy efforts of Stacey Abrams and folks of her nature working to try to subvert the voter suppression laws. That's great. It's wonderful. And so we put our energies into hoping that somehow they succeed. And then if we really feel motivated, we wonder how we can connect with that. But we sit in Vermont and aren't really ready to go to Georgia or wherever, generally, for moments, some of us, et cetera, but that's not enough. And so there's a very, it's an extraordinary moment that we confront.
What about a new Bill of Rights?
Well, that I think that I'm in favor personally of a constitutional convention, but I find I don't spout that because somebody I respect quite a bit, Nancy McLean, whose book Democracy and Change, as long as Charles Koch is alive, she's deathly afraid. You get a constitutional convention, he'll buy the fucking convention. Right. And then we'll have Chile's constitution, which the Chileans overturned after, 40 years, just, 3 months ago. So we should look at what the popular culture of Chile overturned finally. James Buchanan, which was paid for by Charles Koch, the constitution that Pinochet put into place in Chile is now gone. And the Chilean people are building their democracy again. So it's important for us to, witness what they're doing. But And maybe we should just go get clues. I should look into it myself and have more answers on that nature. But it is, it's a risk. The Constitutional Convention is a risk.
Well, yeah, I think that needs to be predicated upon a groundswell of progressive ideology. It can't be risked otherwise. Simple as that.
Yes, I would agree with that. One in my dark moments, and I'm not just feeling one right now. Hell, we can't get people. We can't get people to get vaccinated, let alone talk about structural changes in our system.
Yeah.
In the most demonstratively clear self-interest of an individual is getting vaccinated, and we still can't do that.
Well, right now, there's this idea that we create our own cosmos. We are, in fact, through our own intellect, are creating the cosmos, and it's what it is. And if that is in fact true, then the microcosm of our country is that an enormous population is in fact creating this dystopian society. Mm-hmm. And to counter that, you have to, in fact, if that's in fact true, you have to, in fact, invade the consciousness of those who are infected with the virus of not wearing masks.
Right. Yeah. Reading a book on the psychology of QAnon. I girded my loins and bought the damn book. And according to these authors, these two academics, 17% of Americans buy into QAnon, with about 30+% aren't sure that QAnon isn't right. So you've got a high percentage of people that are off some kind of deep intellectual, emotional cliff. That's tough road to plow, or ground to plow. So.
Gene, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I agree with Tim that campaign finance reform is essential for changing what's going on. If you're going to try to drive toward multiple parties and stuff like that, what are the steps that you would support for gaining campaign finance reform?
I think we have to put pressure on states. It's like what the model may be Vermont, although it's been over 20 years in the Progressive Party, and I've been part of that movement since the beginning of trying to get a viable alternative party. Now we are, I would argue, the most viable state alternative party in the country, but we're still a long way from attempt to making serious impact. We have critical mass in certain areas, and we definitely have moved the debate to the left, but I don't think it's enough. But I would say that would be a model, but everything seems to be, Gene, a long game. Hell, the Republicans have been doing it certainly since the days of the Powell memo of 1971. And they were willing to play that long game. I don't know if the left is willing to play that long game. Of course, it takes money too, and we in the left don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of corporate power, money power behind us, so it makes it even that more challenging. So we don't have the money to play the game, but I think it has to be a long-term game, a game. In order to, in bit by bit, inch by inch, and row by row, in order to make those incremental changes that even I disparage at times, or we get discouraged about at times. So I'm not giving you an answer, but I think it's on a state. I think it's on a state level that you have more opportunities there, because I think democracy is more viable on the state level than on the federal level. So that'd be one way to address it, but I don't have any easy answers.
Well, the America First Act is would be amazing, and even the John Lewis Act which recently I think I read a piece, some editorial that was very clear, and I think appropriately so, that the John Lewis Act just simply says when states move to restrict, suppress the vote, then the Justice Department has to get involved. Period. So when Republicans vote against that, then they're voting overtly in favor of suppressing the vote. Every one of them, and and therefore, for that reason, it should be put forward to the Senate even before the America First Act. But the technicalities, but either one in both would be extremely positive for what also campaign finance reform is gearing towards. Garrett and I, Garrett's on this meeting, worked with the Alliance for Democracy 20 years ago, and we really helped promote and get the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Reform Act and put in place. And this is where, Tim, the Supreme Court is at its worst. This is where it turns a positive into a double negative. One step forward, two steps back. That is the way America tends to have gone. As you opened, relative to progressive steps confronting reactionary actions that destroy what progress has been made. And so this is the America that you and we all live in.
Yeah. And
could I say something? Can you hear me?
Please.
Yeah.
Oh, good, because I don't want to keep looking at that picture of the inside of my ear.
It's okay. It's so intense we can't see it.
The sound went off. Anyway, a few things, Tim. One is it might be that the founders weren't creating a democracy. I mean, in the beginning, it was sort of like they're creating a replacement for the king, right? And it was sort of like a board of directors. In other words, a bunch of us will rule instead of the king, rather than what we now, in our, big-hearted way of trying to see things well,
right.
We think, oh, it's they wanted to create a democracy. Probably not, right? As you've said, I think that agrees with your premise. But we've conned ourselves into thinking that was on the table. And,
let's not blame ourselves on that, on being weak.
Yeah, you provided a lot of evidence there. And another thing is, when we say the Supreme Court, we almost never think of the term, what that term really means, right? What is a court? A court is where you beg the king for something, right? And then when we designed this board of directors to replace the king, we imported that idea of the court as the place where, you go for this fair judgment, which is ridiculous from the start of it. At least it was prior to that. And we have juries and all that. So the very idea of a court is a weird idea. You are asking someone else for approval, and that's a weird idea. Thirdly, I think you mentioned, Tim, on a prior call, or made reference anyway to a study from, maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago, where they were trying to ascertain what the overlap was between what the public wanted and what the legislatures worked for. Right? And they did a lot of polling to see what the public wanted, and then they did a lot of analysis to see what the legislatures worked for. And what they found was the correlation was zero.
Yes.
It was zero,
yes.
Except when what the people wanted happened to be the same as what the rich people wanted. In that case, the correlation was quite high. But other than that, it was zero.
You're right. And Gillens and Page reference that. And the times when there's that kind of that nexus is what the early stages of a war. And that wears out quickly, but
we had it. Well, we've had it in our recent lifetimes a few times with wars, right?
Yeah.
And now we just had this great military-industrial complex, unanimous, uprising on the media, right? The last thing I'll say is, as to what it would take, I think we're fighting within a bag here when we're thinking of passing things and doing things and having committees or whatever. I don't see how they change until they're scared, really scared, not just a little scared so they can devise a strategy to resist their fear, but like, and the model I like it for that is the first Earth Day in 1970, when we had Nixon, right? And we got 10% of the entire US population went to demonstrations that day. Like 25 million, I think it was 25 million.
Remember
Say
that?
again?
I'm just saying that Leonard and I were at one.
Yeah, well, we all were because we were the population. And I think that's what we need.
We were 10% of that population.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean. Anyway, I think that's what we really need. We really need an uprising, call it what you want. And we're so debilitated by the media and social media and the general agreement of civility, where the left in particular clings to civility in response to the right's obnoxiousness. But I do think that's what we need. So I won't talk more. Sorry for the ear.
The IWW
Uprising.
What'd you say,
I think we
Gene?
need a positive uprising and not a destructive one, and that's what's hard to do.
Yeah, and that's hard. I mean, Gandhi
That,
and
well, that the the Earth Day uprising was as positive gets.
Yeah.
And that's why the Sunrise Movement is so influential, even outside of, even on the margins, because and that's what climate change or climate crisis activism engenders. It is about survival.
Yeah, but the first Earth Day was this great movement that said, yeah, we can do this. We have comrades, we have fellow people who are exactly in the same thought we have. And so there was enormous unity, vis-a-vis a late, 60s kind of, milieu, good feeling and comrades and like-minded ideals. And you had also a president, as despicable as he was, that was very much interested in placating, which to a certain extent might have been what he was trying to do. Just a placation, at least at the present time, there is no anticipation from the right of any sort of placation. There is none. They have sworn in 2010 to oppose anything Obama did, and they've been in the same realm for 11 years. So there's no way to get through by 10%, 20, 30, 40, maybe 40%. But we're struggling within the 45 to 55 percentage now, and it's not really holding, and it's not growing, and the money is going elsewhere to spread. William Burroughs was correct. Language is a virus, is echoed by Laurie Anderson, and musical terms. But if it is in fact a virus, they have succumbed. The society is not just ill-informed, it's in fact has a virus. It's sick. And we are not the doctors to cure this part of our society. We just don't have the degree. We don't have the wherewithal to give them that magic potion, because it is a disease they are suffering from, and that's been fed by the misinformation. It's not just misinformation.
Jump in there. I appreciate all you've said here, and everyone. I'm sort of taking it all in. You touched on something just now that sort of we've talked about around how do you reach people who don't want to be reached, which seems central to the whole issue, who don't want to be reached for their own gain or because they've been fed misinformation or what. Tim did a great job of highlighting these various reasons why, or systems in place that keep us from having a true democracy. And I think one of the biggest one is the myth that we in fact do have a democracy, the myth that Leonard, you were speaking of, that you grew up under, and I think we all have for some time. How to dismantle the myth now and in the future. I think education should be the answer, or a big part of the answer. But again, how do you reach those who don't want to be educated, who don't want to be reached? And how do you make this education fair and just and equal and accessible? I see, some potential gains with like the 1619 project, and then soon after we get the 1776 project, right, that combats that. And I don't know how successful that is. It doesn't seem to be, but that's sort of my thinking point on this right now. Is education a viable means of addressing this issue? And if so, how can we reach people who don't want to be reached?
I'd like to address that, if I may, because it does come from an anti-intellectualism that is rampant in the United States now and has a long history. But I've come to realize recently that I've been blindsided by 30 years of republicanism that has led to the current state of affairs. And in so being blindsided, I have been blind. That the Republicans, anti-intellectuals, thinking that the liberals, for lack of any other term, certainly not the progressives, but the liberals, have been stupid. It's not as if they don't like intellect. No, it's that they seem to think that the intellectuals have been really dumb, because the Republicans have pulled this wool over our eyes very successfully. And it has made me feel really quite inadequate and in an intellectual sense. So I'm not sure if education is, in fact, an answer here. They see that what they've done has been positive and effective and works for what they think is right. I mean, that's part of their disillusionment, but still, their disdain for progressive ideals is pretty well founded for themselves. How are you going to convince them that they have not been right? Because in a way, they've been right. They have pulled the wool over, the progressive or liberal Democratic Party as a general rule, and we have been duped. I feel dumb.
I would take a different look at that, in that I don't think we were duped. I just think that those on the moderate left, the liberals in particular, are the source of this dilemma, in that they themselves find it difficult to stand up. I know this is a silly generalization, but I'm going to say it anyway, to stand up for what they really believe in. Just look at who occupies who uses the terminology conservatives. The conservatives use it for themselves. When's the last time we've heard a liberal use the word liberal to describe themselves? I think they've been chicken shit to use it. They can't even
really
use
good
that
point.
terminology.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's an excellent point. Because
Well, that's because they've been rewriting the language, and therefore the ground rules of how we just have a debate and discussion.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, liberals is
a bad word, even for liberals. I mean,
Yes.
I hide from it. You hide from it. We're not liberals. We're progressive, and that's a cover for radicals as well. So we can't even
Speak for yourself, Charlie Brown. I'm a social.
We can't speak honestly about hardly even half of the whole truth.
Yeah.
Right, because it seems un-American.
Right. Yes. Critical race theory. So they blow that up and they do an effective job. Well, effective job because they've got money behind them. They got money and they've got a media. They've got a Fox News and all the rest of the right wingers able to sing that song. We don't have that on the left.
Yeah. Again, we don't have a congregation.
No, we don't.
Where we,
Yeah.
To put it in religious terms or using religious terminology. Thank you very much. This is a really significant evening
Good.
and
Glad
important.
you could join.
Thank you, Slater.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, yeah. I have to go now myself, but I look forward to some further response, and I look forward to seeing if I have any response. Mine is only still theoretical, but I still believe that there's this. I think what we're fighting is a disease,
Mhm. And we need a
and
vaccine.
not you know, theoretical, not you know, an idea. It's a real disease. People are acting in ways that they would never have acted before. They are behaving and they're exhibiting forms of significant misalignment with who they believe they are.
Mhm. Yeah.
But that's all negative, and so I would rather not leave on that note either. But because we still survive, but
Yeah.
we still survive, and
And we're
this is
not
an
giving-
important.
Yeah, and we're not giving up. I'm not giving up. None of us are giving up. you
Right.
know?
Right.
So
Which is
Yeah.
why we're here.
that's why we're here. Right.
Well, even if it's a silly thing, a proposal for a Bill of Rights in which, you know, you're going to invite people to come and shout out their interests and their desires and what they would like for our country.
Yeah.
How about that as just getting out and into the streets, for example? And that's where we would voice this type of ideology again.
Mhm.
I am of the mind to agree with you, Leonard, completely. And while I mentioned, Nancy McLean and her misgiving, and I completely understand it. Charles Koch, his brother's gone. He can't be, too far along. It doesn't really matter. We've got to somehow or other rally the American people and even more beyond these United States to imagine that we get to recreate our own democracy, that we get to recreate our own,
Kangaroo court.
and a new constitutional convention is not a bad moniker to start distributing or disseminating.
What if we had our own constitutional convention, not one that was sanctioned, but our own constitutional convention as to what we would like to see, or a kangaroo court to, in fact, bring some levity into our situation for one thing, but also to do it with a great deal of irreverent reverence to our ideals. Oh, I like that term. Irreverent relevance.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Leonard.
Good night.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I think I am going to go as well.
Okay, brother.
All right.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Yep. And thank you, people, for participating. Okay.
Tim, thanks for a great presentation. That was excellent and coherent and devastating to anybody who disagrees, or who might have disagreed before.
It would be nice to get somebody here like that.
Good night.
All right. Good night.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Tim. This is great. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Yeah. See you, Nick.
All right.
Bye.
See you, Peter. Marley. All right. Ciao. Thanks very much, guys. We'll all be in communication immediately. Gene, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a
Thanks
great
for the
evening.
show.
Yeah.
Yeah.